Most great aircraft are born from triumph. The F-14 Tomcat was born from failure. In the late 1960s, the United States Navy found itself standing on the edge of a strategic disaster. The jet meant to secure the future of American carrier aviation, the F-111B, had collapsed under its own weight, cost, and impossible compromises. The Navy needed a fighter that could do everything the Phantom did, everything the F-111 was supposed to do, and more. And they needed it fast. Because on the other side of the world, the Soviet Union was building bigger bombers, faster missiles, and more dangerous long-range weapons aimed directly at American carrier strike groups. If the Navy didn't find a solution, the era of carrier dominance could end. From the ashes of that crisis, the Grumman engineers would create an aircraft so capable, so adaptable, and so iconic that pilots would remember it as lightning in a bottle. But the story of the F-14 didn't begin with glory. It began with fear, political pressure, and a race against time. The problem: no one could ignore. The F-111B was supposed to be the future, a shared Air Force-Navy fighter designed during Robert McNamara's push for common aircraft. But reality punished the idea. The F-111B was too heavy for carriers, too sluggish in dogfights, and too dangerous to land on a pitching deck in rough seas. Test pilots describe bringing it aboard as catching a falling safe. By 1968, the Navy quietly admitted what everyone already knew. The F-111B would never protect a carrier battle group. They needed a new airplane, one designed around naval realities. Folding wings for carrier decks, durability for brutal saltwater operations, long range to intercept Soviet threats, and agility to dominate close-in dogfights. This aircraft had to be faster, tougher, and smarter than anything the U.S. had ever built. Grumman steps into the arena. When the Navy launched its VFX, Naval Fighter Experimental Competition, two companies entered the ring: McDonnell Douglas and Grumman Aerospace. McDonnell Douglas already had the F-4 Phantom and political influence on its side. Grumman, on the other hand, had something far more powerful: a reputation for building rugged, reliable machines that survived the unforgiving world of carrier aviation. From the Wildcat and Hellcat of W.I. Stru to the Intruder and Hawkeye, Grumman had become known as the Iron Works, a company that built aircraft that simply refused to die. Their VFX proposal stunned the Navy. It had everything: a powerful radar system, variable sweep wings, twin engines for safety over the ocean, space for the revolutionary AIM-54 Phoenix missile, and room for a two-person crew, pilot and RIO. This would not be a compromise. This would be a purpose-built, carrier-borne weapon system. The Navy chose Grumman, and with that decision, the F-14 Tomcat began its journey. The first glimpse of the beast. The prototype rolled out in 1970, a silhouette unlike anything the public had ever seen. Swept wings folded back like the claws of a hunting cat, twin tails angled outward, a long pointed nose housing one of the most advanced radars in the world. It looked fast even when parked. It looked angry. It looked ready. On December 21, 1970, in Calverton, New York, the Tomcat lifted off for the first time. The flight lasted only a few minutes, just a loop around the field, but it was smooth, successful, and filled the Grumman team with hope. But hope didn't last long. Disaster strikes. 9 days later, on December 30, 1970, the Tomcat's second test flight took place. This time, something went terribly wrong. A hydraulic failure crippled the aircraft during approach. With the F-14 losing control and altitude, the crew made the only decision left. They ejected. The prototype smashed into the ground and exploded. Inside the Pentagon, voices rose. The program is cursed. Another F-111B disaster. Shut it down. And the Navy listened. The Tomcat was suddenly in danger of being canceled before it even existed. In today's political climate, that crash might have ended the entire program. But the early 1970s had one advantage. People still believed engineers could fix problems if given the chance. Grumman didn't waste a second. Rebuilding trust, line-by-line engineers worked around the clock. Hydraulic systems were redesigned. Lines, supports, valves, the entire architecture was rethought. Technicians ran tests 24 hours a day, listening to pumps, calibrating sensors, tracing frequencies one wire at a time. The goal wasn't just to repair the aircraft. The goal was to prove to the Navy that the F-14 could be trusted with the lives of young aviators. The pressure was enormous. If Grumman failed, the Navy would be left with no modern fighter, and the Soviets were watching every move. By early 1971, Grumman returned with a redesigned system. The Navy approved more test flights, and the Tomcat flew again. This time, the aircraft didn't just work, it impressed. The turning point. As prototypes began flying more frequently, the Tomcat revealed its true potential. Pilots reported something extraordinary. The aircraft, despite its size, handled beautifully. It was stable, powerful, and intuitive. The variable sweep wings gave it agility at low speed and stability at high speed, something no previous Navy fighter had managed with such elegance. Behind the scenes, Congress still had doubts. The Tomcat was expensive. You couldn't just approve billions based on pretty flight tests. But then came the moment that changed everything: the integration of the Phoenix missile. Suddenly, the F-14 wasn't just another fighter. It was a complete weapons ecosystem, one capable of detecting, tracking, and destroying multiple Soviet bombers long before they could attack the fleet. The Navy realized something. If this aircraft succeeded, carrier groups would remain the most powerful naval assets in the world, and that made the Tomcat worth every penny. A legend takes shape. In 1972, the first carrier trials took place. Some landings were smooth, others exposed flaws, like nose gear hydraulic leaks, at the worst possible moment. But each challenge was overcome. Each failure made the aircraft stronger. By 1973, the F-14 officially entered service in the U.S. Navy. The legend had begun. What started as a desperate attempt to replace a flawed aircraft had transformed into one of the most capable fighters ever built, a machine that would dominate the skies for 3 decades, win real combat, inspire generations, and become a symbol of American air power. But the F-14's rise had only begun. The battles, breakthroughs, and near disasters that would follow were far more dramatic than anything in its early years. The Tomcat was ready for war, and the world was about to learn its name. The F-14's early triumphs were impressive, but its survival was anything but guaranteed. By the mid-1970s, the Tomcat stood at a crossroads. It had entered service, it had completed its first carrier deployments, and yet the aircraft still carried the weight of political skepticism and technical controversy. Every triumph had to be earned the hard way, and every failure, real or perceived, risked killing the program outright. What followed was a decade of relentless testing, behind-the-scenes battles, and a level of engineering determination rarely seen in modern aviation. The Tomcat was not simply refined during these years, it was forged. The long road of proving itself. After the initial flights and rushed redesigns, the Navy demanded absolute proof that the Tomcat could not only fly safely, but perform every mission the fleet expected of it. That meant testing the aircraft in ways few fighters had ever been tested. At the Grumman facilities in Calverton and Bethpage, engineers tore into every system. The Tomcat's variable geometry wings were subjected to thousands of cycles at extreme angles. Structural prototypes were literally tortured in hangars, stressed, bent, twisted, to simulate years of carrier landings and combat maneuvers. Test pilots pushed the aircraft to its aerodynamic limits, exploring high angles of attack, sudden loaded rolls, steep climbs, and low-speed approaches. Meanwhile, the Navy wanted more than flight data. They wanted a support ecosystem. To meet that demand, Grumman, together with Hughes Aircraft, constructed one of the most advanced test environments of its time, the SITS Lab, the Systems Integration Test Station. Inside what looked like a giant metal cocoon sat the gutted fuselage of an F-14 packed with avionics, radar components, and electronics. Engineers could simulate entire missions, weapons engagements, and radar behavior without ever leaving the ground. This wasn't just clever, it was revolutionary. And it would soon prove essential: failures, fixes, and the men who kept the program alive. No aircraft program climbs without stumbling, and the Tomcat stumbled loudly in 1973. During a missile test off Point Mugu, test pilot Pete Purvis fired an AIM-7 Sparrow. The missile malfunctioned violently, erupting into a fireball behind the aircraft and engulfing the rear fuselage in flames. Purvis instinctively pitched upward, hoping the fire would choke itself out in thinner air. But the fire had already eaten through key control rods. The Tomcat entered an uncontrollable roll. Purvis and his radar intercept officer ejected. They survived. And the next day, after medical checks and a debriefing, they went bowling. To the engineers, that attitude embodied the F-14 community. The aircraft might be dangerous, but so were the men asked to test it. The failure triggered an urgent review. Within days, engineers identified the problem in the missile's guidance software. A patch was written, tested in the SITS lab, validated in real time, and sent back to the fleet. The speed of the fix stunned Navy leadership. For the first time, they realized the Tomcat team could solve problems faster than Washington could criticize them. First blood, first impressions. By late 1973, the fleet finally had operational Tomcats. VF-1 and VF-2, Wolfpack, and Bounty Hunters became the first squadrons to take the aircraft on deployment. For the pilots, these early cruises were eye-opening. The Tomcat's range was enormous. Its radar, later versions of the AWG-9, was unmatched. The aircraft could find, track, and engage targets far beyond visual range, well before enemy fighters realized they were being watched. And the two-seat cockpit, once criticized as old-fashioned, proved invaluable. The pilot could fight the plane. The RIO could fight the battle. During these deployments, the Navy also received a strange request. The Shah of Iran wanted the Tomcat. At the time, Iran was a key U.S. ally and sat directly beneath the flight path of Soviet bombers headed toward the Persian Gulf. The Tomcat's long-range reach and Phoenix missile made it a perfect fit. The deal was approved. 79 Tomcats were shipped overseas. Iranian pilots trained in the United States. Their presence alone changed the strategic balance of the region. It was one of the few foreign sales allowed for a cutting-edge U.S. fighter. That fact alone spoke volumes. Challenges from within. Despite successes, the Tomcat faced pressures that had nothing to do with performance. Congress was uneasy about the aircraft's cost. Newspapers questioned whether the Navy truly needed something so large and complex. Political factions pushed for alternatives, for budget cuts, for more economical fighter programs that promised results without the price tag. But the Tomcat had a secret weapon: data. Every touchdown, every flight hour, every test, whether in California, Maryland, or at sea, generated mountains of information. Engineers used it to refine software, tweak hydraulic behavior, and adjust the aircraft's flight characteristics. And slowly, evidence overtook skepticism. In fact, in 1976, during a major congressional evaluation, the Tomcat performed so well that the committee overseeing the review, expected to write a critical report, returned with praise instead. Still, the engine problems from the early years refused to fade away. The TF-30 engines, originally designed for a different aircraft, proved temperamental, especially in high-angle maneuvers. Compressor stalls became infamous, and for pilots, that meant unwanted surprises during aggressive dogfighting practice. Yet the Navy pressed on. By the late 1970s, they quietly accepted the Tomcat's flaws because its strengths were simply greater. Plans for improved engines were in motion, but until then, pilots learned to fly around the TF-30's weaknesses. The Tomcat demanded respect, and it rewarded pilots who earned it. The breakthrough moment: 6 targets, 1 fighter. What finally silenced the doubters was not an air show, not a test flight, and not a Senate hearing. It was the demonstration that changed aviation history: the 6-on-6. The AWG-9 radar could track 24 targets at once. The Phoenix missile could travel 100 nautical miles at Mach 4. Engineers believed the F-14 could engage 6 separate targets simultaneously, but belief wasn't proof. So the Navy ordered a live demonstration. 6 targets of different speeds and altitudes, including supersonic drones, were launched across the Pacific Test Range. The Tomcat locked onto all 6, fired 6 Phoenix missiles in rapid succession, and watched as 5 made direct, lethal hits. The 6th would have hit too, had its target not malfunctioned. The message was unmistakable. The F-14 wasn't just a fighter, it was an airborne fortress. When the test data reached Washington, funding stabilized. Concerns softened. The Tomcat was no longer fighting for approval. It was fighting to fulfill its destiny. By the end of the 1970s, the Tomcat had survived political pressure, rebounded from major failures, proven unmatched missile capability, completed fleet deployments, won international recognition, earned the trust of carrier crews, and established itself as America's frontline air superiority fighter. But the greatest test of all, real combat, still lay ahead. The 1980s would elevate the Tomcat from a promising aircraft to a global icon. And in the skies above the Mediterranean, the Gulf of Sidra, and the Middle East, the F-14 would show the world exactly what it was capable of. By the dawn of the 1980s, the United States Navy no longer wondered whether the F-14 Tomcat could defend a carrier strike group. The question had shifted to something far more consequential: how would it perform when the shooting started? For years, the Tomcat had carried the weight of Cold War expectations, an interceptor built to stop Soviet bombers before they could launch their deadly payloads. But the Cold War rarely behaved according to expectations. And when the Tomcat finally met real combat, the world would learn that this aircraft was far more than a long-range missile platform. It was a true dogfighter, a deterrent, and, unexpectedly, a movie star. The Gulf of Sidra, where the Tomcat drew first blood. On August 19, 1981, 2 VF-41 Tomcats from the USS Nimitz were flying routine combat air patrol over the Mediterranean, watching over American ships operating near waters Libya claimed as its own. The political tension in the area was already high. Muammar Gaddafi had declared the line of death, warning that any foreign aircraft crossing it would be attacked. The Tomcats crossed it anyway, and the Libyans reacted exactly as expected. 2 Sukhoi Su-22 fitters, fast attack jets armed with heat-seeking missiles, roared toward the American fighters. One of the Su-22s fired first. An AA-2 Atoll streaked past an F-14, missing by sheer luck. Rules of engagement were instantly satisfied. The Tomcats fired back. In seconds, both Libyan jets were smoking wreckage falling into the sea. The engagement was clean, decisive, and perfectly executed. 2 kills, 0 losses. American pilots Larry Music Muzinski and Hank Hammer Kleeman had just given the F-14 its first combat victories. The message to Gaddafi and the world was unmistakable. The Tomcat wasn't just intimidating, it was lethal. The kill ratio now stood at U.S. Navy 2, Libya 0. And this was only the beginning. Lebanon, a new battlefield, a new role. In 1983, the Tomcat found itself hovering over a different kind of conflict, the Lebanese Civil War. The U.S. Navy lost an A-6 Intruder and an A-7 Corsair to surface-to-air missiles in the first days of operations. Suddenly, the question wasn't whether the Tomcat could win air-to-air engagements. It was whether it could survive a dense, unpredictable web of missile batteries along the Beirut coastline. To solve this, the Navy urgently needed an electronic countermeasure, the ALQ-167 jammer. They called Point Mugu on a Thursday afternoon. By Tuesday, F-14s in the Mediterranean were flying with the system installed. That speed was unheard of. It required Navy engineers, Grumman technicians, and civilian experts working side by side through the weekend, designing brackets, writing software, flight testing the configuration, and certifying it for combat use. The result? F-14s were fired on multiple times over Lebanon. None were hit. This campaign demonstrated something the public rarely saw. The Tomcat wasn't just a fighter, it was the product of a vast, agile human network. When the fleet needed something, the F-14 community delivered. 1989, the final Sidra shootdown. 8 years after the Su-22 incident, history repeated itself. On January 4, 1989, 2 Libyan MiG-23 floggers closed in on a pair of VF-32 Tomcats from the USS Kennedy. The MiGs behaved aggressively, repeatedly locking onto the Americans and pushing them toward a confrontation. After several evasive turns and heel-to-toe attempts to defuse the encounter, the MiGs kept coming. The Tomcats fired. 2 sidewinders, 2 floggers down. The scoreboard now read, U.S. Navy 4, Libya 0. The engagements were more than tactical victories. They were symbolic. The Tomcat had never been beaten in real combat. It had never been outflown, outmaneuvered, or outgunned. In every confrontation, it dominated. To adversaries, it became a jet to avoid. To allies, it became a reassuring presence in a dangerous world. Top Gun, from combat aircraft to cultural icon. But nothing elevated the F-14's reputation more than an unexpected Hollywood phenomenon. In 1986, Top Gun exploded into theaters, delivering high-energy dogfights, afterburner shots, and the unforgettable silhouette of the F-14 slicing through the California sky. The film wasn't fiction. It was filmed with real Navy aircraft, real pilots, and real tactics. The F-14 wasn't a prop. It was the star. For millions of Americans, especially those over 40 who remembered the Cold War, the Tomcat became more than a military machine. It became a symbol of national strength, courage, and technological superiority. Kids built Tomcat model kits. Adults hung posters on garage walls. Enlistment in naval aviation spiked. And in a quiet but significant way, the film also revealed something authentic: the unique partnership between pilot and RIO. The two-crew concept, once mocked as outdated, was now immortalized in pop culture. In real life, this partnership was essential. Pilots flew the aircraft. RIOs fought the battle, managing the radar, tracking threats, guiding missiles, and navigating complex engagements. The Tomcat was not a one-man show, it was a duet. The engine problem that refused to die for all its success, the F-14 still carried a flaw that pilots feared: the Pratt & Whitney TF-30 engines. Originally designed for the ill-fated F-111, these engines were notoriously sensitive to airflow disruptions. Sudden throttle changes or high angle of attack maneuvers could trigger compressor stalls, moments when the engine effectively stopped working and produced violent yaw. In a dogfight, a stall could kill. Pilots learned to fly around the danger zones. They memorized throttle settings and practiced recovery techniques. They built habits and instincts. Yet despite the risks, the Tomcat still dominated in training. It could outclimb, outturn, and out-energy most adversaries. And when the upgraded F-14B and F-14D finally arrived with the powerful GE-110 engines, the aircraft became what pilots had always dreamed it could be: brutally fast, responsive, and nearly impossible to outmaneuver. But that transformation belonged to the next chapter. In the 1980s, the F-14 had to fight with what it had, and fight it did. The high-tech backbone behind the victories. While pilots and RIOs earned the headlines, thousands of men and women kept the Tomcat alive behind the scenes. Maintenance crews routinely poured 45-50 man-hours into every hour of flight. They replaced burnt wiring, inspected titanium ribs, polished hydraulic fittings, and calibrated radar modules until their hands were black with graphite and fuel residue. Engineers at Point Mugu continued pushing software improvements. Grumman technicians crawled inside cramped fuselage compartments, solving issues that would never make it into newspapers. Analysts processed flight data that looked more like astrophysics than aviation. This invisible army didn't appear in Top Gun, but without them, the F-14 would never have survived the decade. By the end of the 1980s, the F-14 was no longer the troubled aircraft born from a canceled fighter program. It had become a proven dogfighter, a strategic deterrent, a symbol recognized around the world, an undefeated combat aircraft, and the face of American naval aviation. The Tomcat had not yet reached its final form. That would come in the 1990s when it evolved into the Bombcat, a precision strike platform few believed it could ever become. But the foundation of that transformation, the reputation, the confidence, the battle-tested legacy, was built in the 1980s. And the world had only seen the beginning of what this aircraft could do. By the early 1990s, the Tomcat stood at a crossroads. The Cold War was over. The Soviet bomber threat, the very reason the F-14 had been created, was fading into history. Carrier air wings were shrinking, budgets were tightening, and the Navy faced a difficult question. What do you do with a fighter built for a world that no longer exists? For many aircraft, this would have been the end of the story. But for the F-14 Tomcat, it became the beginning of an unexpected evolution, one that would turn a pure interceptor into one of the most capable precision strike platforms of its time. This metamorphosis was not easy. It faced resistance from pilots, technical challenges that seemed impossible, and political hesitation. Yet once again, the Tomcat community refused to let the aircraft fade quietly. The result was the Bombcat, a machine far more versatile than anyone believed it could be. A fighter without a war. When Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait in 1990, the U.S. Navy deployed its Tomcats to the Gulf expecting a large-scale air war. But something surprising happened. The F-14 saw little action. While the Tomcat's long-range radar and Phoenix missile were powerful, they were meant for high-altitude bomber interceptions, missions that simply weren't needed in Desert Storm. Newer fighters like the F-A-18 Hornet were carrying laser-guided bombs and attacking ground targets. Tomcat crews, who'd spent decades mastering air-to-air tactics, suddenly watched other aircraft dominate the conflict. And a painful truth became clear. If the F-14 didn't adapt, it would become obsolete. Inside the Navy, the debate became heated. Many senior Tomcat pilots were fiercely proud of the jet's original purpose. They'd spent their entire careers fighting for air superiority, not dropping bombs. For them, turning the Tomcat into a bomber felt like sacrilege. But war was changing, and the aircraft had to change with it. The birth of the Lantiron Tomcat. In the early 1990s, a small group of engineers and aviators proposed a radical idea: install a Lantiron targeting pod, originally developed for the F-15E Strike Eagle, onto the Tomcat. If successful, it would give the F-14 laser-guided precision strike capability, independent targeting, and night attack abilities. The idea was met with skepticism, even ridicule. The Tomcat was huge, heavy, and complex. It had never been designed for low-altitude strike missions. The TF-30 engines, on the A model, made aggressive diving attacks risky, and integrating a new targeting pod required deep changes to the aircraft's avionics. To many, it seemed impossible. But the Tomcat community had built a reputation on doing the impossible. A test aircraft was pulled into the hangar at Point Mugu. Engineers removed panels, rerouted wiring harnesses, fabricated new mounting brackets, and patched software in ways that weren't in any official manual. They ran tests in the SITS lab, aligned sensors, and calibrated displays in the rear cockpit. Pilots flew trial runs, learning how to handle the aircraft in precision dive attacks it had never performed before. On March 21, 1995, the first Lantiron-equipped F-14 flew. The results were astonishing. For the first time in its history, the Tomcat could find, track, and laze targets entirely on its own. It could do so at night, in bad weather, and with precision rivaling the best strike fighters in the world. The Bombcat was born. A fighter pilot's reality check. Not all pilots were enthusiastic. Many had signed up to fly a pure dogfighter, not a multi-role strike jet. Some resisted the change. Others openly complained. But the moment they saw what the new system could do, attitudes changed. Pilots who had spent their careers flying high above the clouds were suddenly performing steep dive attacks at 45 degrees. RIOs, once focused on radar intercepts, became precision targeteers, managing laser locks, pod settings, and target coordinates with pinpoint accuracy. The transformation wasn't just technical, it was cultural. The Tomcat community was rewriting its identity in real time. The Bombcat goes to war. Once deployed, the Bombcat proved its worth immediately. Bosnia, 1995. F-14s flew forward air controller, airborne missions, directing strikes for NATO aircraft during the conflict. Their sensor clarity and long on-station time made them invaluable. Operation Desert Fox, 1998. Bombcats dropped laser-guided bombs on Iraqi targets with surgical precision, often in complex urban environments. Kosovo, 1999. During NATO's air campaign over Serbia, Tomcats flew hundreds of precision strike missions. Their ability to carry multiple 2,000-pound bombs and guide them independently gave commanders a powerful new tool. For an aircraft originally designed to kill bombers at long range, these missions represented a total reinvention. The Tomcat wasn't just keeping up with modern warfare, it was excelling in it. The JDAM revolution. Just when it seemed the Bombcat had reached its peak, the Navy asked for one more upgrade: integration of the Joint Direct Attack Munition, JDAM, a GPS-guided bomb capable of hitting targets through clouds, smoke, sandstorms, and darkness. The request came with almost no notice. A Navy program manager called Point Mugu on a Friday. "We need JDAM on the F-14, and we need it now." By Monday morning, engineers were already on planes to Puerto Rico to train squadron crews. What followed was a whirlwind: installing new hardware, patching software, writing tactical procedures, and teaching pilots and RIOs how to employ a weapon that had never been part of the Tomcat's original design. When the next war came, Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, the F-14D was ready. On the first night of the war, Tomcats dropped GPS-guided weapons with stunning accuracy. They supported special forces in northern Iraq. They provided real-time imagery to troops on the ground. They struck strategic targets deep inside enemy territory. This marked the final evolution of the Tomcat, from pure fighter to interceptor to precision strike aircraft. A second life earned, not given. The Bombcat program was never meant to be permanent. It was originally a stopgap, an attempt to modernize the Tomcat just long enough to keep it relevant. Instead, it became one of the most successful transitions in naval aviation history. In the 1990s, the Tomcat was not simply extended, it was transformed. Its radar was upgraded, its displays were digitized, its engines were modernized, and its mission expanded far beyond what Grumman engineers imagined in the 1960s. By the end of the decade, the Tomcat wasn't fading out. It was leading the carrier air wing. And yet, everyone knew a difficult truth. No matter how capable the Bombcat became, no matter how many enemies it outflew or outgunned, the aircraft's time was running out. Maintenance demands were enormous, parts were aging, and the Navy's future rested on the incoming F/A-18E/F Super Hornet. But before the Tomcat could bow out, it would deliver one last act of brilliance, its final chapter, where decades of innovation, sacrifice, and determination converged in the twilight of an American legend. By the dawn of the 2000s, the F-14 Tomcat carried a paradox on its wings. It was more capable than it had ever been, faster with its GE-110 engines, more precise with its Lantern pod, deadlier with JDAM, and more battle-tested than most aircraft of its generation. Yet at the same time, it was standing in the shadow of its own retirement. The Navy admired the aircraft. Pilots loved it. Crews respected it. But budgets, logistics, and the rising Super Hornet fleet sealed the Tomcat's fate. The final chapter of the Tomcat's story would be the longest, the most emotional, and the most human. Not just the tale of an aircraft, but of the thousands of people who built it, fought for it, flew it, and kept it alive long after logic said it should have been grounded. The burden of greatness. The Tomcat was a masterpiece, but masterpieces are never simple. Every hour in the air demanded 45 to 50 hours of maintenance on the ground. Hydraulic systems needed constant inspection. The swing wing mechanism required meticulous lubrication and calibration. Avionics bays, packed with 1970s wiring and 1980s upgrades, demanded patience and the hands of technicians who had memorized the aircraft's interior like the back of their hand. The Navy jokingly described the F-14 as a diva, but it wasn't really a joke. Its titanium spine was rock solid, but its plumbing, especially in the early A models, was unpredictable. Servicing the radar meant crawling through cramped compartments. Accessing the engines meant working with a design that predated the sleek quick-change modules of newer fighters. But to those who worked on it, these challenges were points of pride. No one maintained the Tomcat without developing a personal bond with it. Many maintainers described the aircraft as alive, temperamental, demanding, but fiercely loyal once understood. Training for a new century. As the aircraft evolved, so did the training. At NAS Miramar and later NAS Oceana, entire buildings became temples to the Tomcat. Cockpit simulators, massive mock-ups with real switches and authentic hydraulic behavior, allowed pilots and RIOs to repeat carrier approaches, emergency procedures, and radar intercepts over and over until they could perform them half asleep. Maintenance hangars housed iron birds, giant skeletal frames of the F-14 used to teach technicians the secrets of flight controls, hydraulics, and weapon systems. The ordnance schools trained sailors to load Phoenixes, Sparrows, Sidewinders, and later JDAMs and GBU-24 bunker busters. Every Tomcat sailor, pilot, RIO, maintainer, ordnance man, carried a piece of the aircraft inside them. By the 2000s, training wasn't just preparation, it was preservation of a legacy. The final push. Operation Iraqi Freedom. In 2003, when the United States prepared for large-scale operations in Iraq, the Navy deployed 3 F-14D squadrons. The Tomcat community received an urgent message. JDAM integration must be completed immediately. What should have taken months happened in days. Point Mugu engineers were flown to Puerto Rico for emergency system checks. Software specialists coded through the night. Technicians installed new hardware in the desert heat of the Gulf. These weren't just upgrades. They were life-or-death preparations. When the war began, Tomcats took off into the darkness of the Persian Gulf and delivered GPS-guided weapons with stunning precision. They destroyed air defense systems, command bunkers, radar sites, and armored columns. They provided real-time imagery to special forces in northern Iraq. They flew deep strike missions hundreds of miles inland. The Tomcat, nearing the end of its career, had just delivered one of its finest performances. The final years, pride and pain. The early 2000s were bittersweet. Pilots loved flying the Tomcat more than any aircraft in the Navy's inventory, but they could see the writing on the wall. Spare parts were becoming scarce. Airframes were aging. Engineers who had designed the Tomcat were retiring. Depots like the one in Jacksonville, Florida, once hubs of Tomcat refurbishment, were closing their doors. Every flight hour became more precious. Every launch from the carrier deck felt heavier. Every night landing under red lights was a reminder that the aircraft's days were numbered. Yet the Tomcat community never wavered. They kept the jets flying, refined tactics, and trained younger aviators who knew they wouldn't fly the aircraft for long, but wanted to experience its power before it disappeared forever. A dignified farewell. In 2006, the Navy announced the official retirement of the F-14 Tomcat. The decision was rational, economical, and strategically sound, and completely heartbreaking. Squadrons began flying their final cruises. Maintenance crews polished panels with unusual care. Pilots took one last turn at the controls of the jet they had spent their careers mastering. RIOs memorized the sound of the AWG-9's radar sweep. A final airshow tour was organized. Crowds came by the tens of thousands. Older veterans who remembered the Cold War, families who had grown up with Top Gun, teenagers who had only seen the aircraft in documentaries but wanted to witness the legend for themselves. At one show, as an F-14 executed a perfect high-speed pass, a Navy veteran in his 60s whispered, "I can feel that in my bones." That was the Tomcat. It didn't just fly, it connected. The last flight. On September 22, 2006, the final F-14 in U.S. military service took off from NAS Oceana. Its engines roared across the coastline. Its wings swept back one last time. And as it landed at Republic Airport in Long Island, near the birthplace of the Tomcat, thousands gathered to watch the end of an era. Pilots saluted. Crew members cried openly. Veterans touched the aircraft's skin like they were saying goodbye to an old friend. The Tomcat had served for 32 years. It had protected carrier groups across the world. It had never lost a dogfight. It had defined a generation of naval aviation. This was its curtain call. Afterlife of a Titan. Although the Tomcat left U.S. service, its story didn't end. Iran continued to operate the F-14s purchased in the 1970s, keeping them alive through improvised engineering, reverse engineering, and black market parts. Despite sanctions, they remain in service today, testament to the aircraft's durability. In museums across the United States, Tomcats sit on display, some mounted proudly outside naval bases, others preserved indoors with polished canopies and immaculate paint. Children climb the ladders. Veterans explain the wings. Tourists marvel at the size. And online, on forums, in documentaries, in stories told by former pilots, the Tomcat remains fiercely alive. A legacy beyond metal. The F-14 was never just an aircraft. It was a community, a culture, a symbol. It was the sound of twin afterburners tearing across a carrier deck. It was the silhouette of swept wings diving toward a target. It was the teamwork of a pilot and RIO working in perfect harmony. It was the confidence of a fleet knowing the sky above them was protected. And for the men and women who devoted their lives to this machine, who flew it, fixed it, tested it, and risked everything inside it, the Tomcat became a part of who they were. When the Navy retired the aircraft, they didn't just end a program. They closed a chapter of American history. Epilogue. The legend that refused to die. Ask any pilot who flew the Tomcat what it meant to them, and the answer is never clinical, never technical, never about range, thrust, or radar modes. They'll tell you about feeling invincible at the controls. They'll tell you about the bond with their RIO. They'll tell you that no other aircraft ever flew like the F-14. They'll tell you the truth. The Tomcat was alive. Today, decades after its final flight, the F-14 remains one of the most beloved aircraft ever built. It stands shoulder to shoulder with the P-51 Mustang, the Spitfire, and the Phantom in the pantheon of aviation greatness. And in the quiet corners of airfields, museums, and veterans' reunions, the same phrase is still spoken: "We caught lightning in a bottle." The Tomcat wasn't just a fighter, it was a legend, one forged in danger, refined in battle, and remembered with the kind of reverence reserved for the greatest machines ever to touch the sky.